2 weeks from today, or 2 weeks from yesterday, I should say, we're going to be having our annual golf tournament, and we haven't had a whole lot of people sign up yet, but we've had a lot of people tell us they're going to play. We really need to know. You don't have to pay today, but please let Jacob or me know if you're going to be playing in that tournament, okay? Again, it's open to everybody. You don't have to be a certain skill level to play in it. Just come and have a good time, and it will benefit Wise Foundation. And so I invite you, but please just let us know, would you? And also I want to mention that a month from now, on October 14th, Don McLaughlin is going to be here to preach for us that day. And my son says Don McLaughlin is the best preacher in Churches of Christ. He is incredible. And I want you to plan this on your calendar. This is really important that you be here for this day. It's a big day in the life of our church. So plan on being here, and you will not be disappointed. Don and I are going to talk that morning about his book called Love First. Sermons is the most important one I ever preach or anything like that. But I'm telling you, today's sermon and next week's are vitally important. They're vitally important to us if we really want to see Jesus clearly. So we're going to look at a story today that involves one of the strangest miracles in the life of Jesus. And that's saying a lot. Because back in chapter 5, there was a really weird miracle where Jesus cast demons out of this man and cast them into some pigs who then went squealing and jumped off a cliff into the sea. Now, that's weird, isn't it? But today we're in Mark chapter 8 and verse 22. And it says this: they came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He was outside the village. When he spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" This story begins normal enough. People bring this blind man to Jesus, ask him if he can do something for them. And so Jesus then does what any of us would do in his situation, right? He takes this man by the hand, he leads him outside the village, and he spits in his face. That's weird. And that's not even the weird part. Because then he asked this man, "Do you see anything?" Almost as if to ask, did it work? And this is strange for a couple of reasons. First of all, because miracles aren't usually a problem for Jesus. So is he going through a slump? Maybe he got too close to some kryptonite? Why is he unsure? And why does he take this man outside of town? Is it so that he can get away from the people just in case it doesn't work this time? And maybe he has an attitude kind of like, well, here goes nothing. And even stranger than all of that is the response of this blind man, who says in verse 24, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." He's seeing, but he's not seeing clearly. He's been healed. Sorta. And so Jesus says, "Let me try again." So once more Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened, his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home saying, "Don't even go into the village." That's a strange story, isn't it? How do we make sense of it? Let me share with you 3 options that we have, and maybe you can come up with more. But the first option is one that I haven't seen any theologians suggest. But maybe this blind man can't see after the first time because he's got spit in his eyes. And so maybe Jesus then goes again and takes the spit out of his eyes, and then he can see. That one doesn't seem like a very good answer to me, but you got to admit it's a possibility. Or maybe this was just a really tough case of blindness. I mean, Bartimaeus, earlier in the story, that wasn't that big a deal, but maybe this is a blindness that's more difficult. That doesn't settle well with me. Is anything too difficult for Jesus, who created us? And so maybe it's the third option. Maybe Mark is placing this miracle where he is because it serves purposes to his story. Maybe Mark, who is the only one, by the way, who records this particular miracle, maybe he's put it right here to illustrate a point for us. And this is a point we must not miss. Could it be that there's a deeper meaning to this story that we can't clearly see yet ourselves? So let's put this strange story on hold for just a moment, and I want to come back to it and move to one of the most climactic stories in Mark's gospel. Up to this point, this is the most climactic story. And so everything in this gospel so far has been leading up to this moment that we're getting ready to read in verse 27. Because in chapters 1 to 8, about half the gospel of Mark has been intent on answering one question for us. And the question is, who is Jesus? And so in chapter 1, when Jesus is baptized, the heavens open and the Father speaks and says, "This is my Son whom I love." Later in that same chapter, though, Jesus heals a demon-possessed man. And the demons themselves say, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." So the demons know who he is, but in that same chapter, just a few verses later, the people are asking, who is this? Chapter 2, a paralytic's lowered through the roof, right there in front of Jesus, and Jesus says, "My son, your sins are forgiven." And the people ask, who can forgive sins except for God alone? Who is this man? You see, Mark's wanting us to wrestle with that as we're reading the story. Later in that chapter, Jesus goes to dinner at Levi's house, that's Matthew, eating with tax collectors and sinners, and the Pharisees say, who is this man that he eats with tax collectors and sinners? Who is this man? Chapter 3, the Pharisees claim that Jesus has the powers to work miracles that comes from Beelzebub, the devil. Chapter 4, he stills the storm, which leads the disciples to ask, who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. Chapter 6, returning to his hometown in Nazareth, the people are amazed at his miracles. And yet, even though they're amazed at his miracles, they ask, isn't this that kid that used to run around in the streets here? We remember him when he was growing up. Who is this guy? Who does he think he is? And whom of all people should know who he is. As we saw last week, they're not sure what to think about him either. And so let's return to last week for just a moment. You remember, if you were here, Jesus fed the 4,000. And after he fed the 4,000, the Pharisees come to argue, and Jesus just didn't know arguing right now. So gets his disciples, and they get in the boat to go to the other side of the lake. And as they're in the boat, it says that the disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it's because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see? Here's the vision thing again. And ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And that question just hangs there. It's a deafening question as it just hangs there. Do you still not understand? But before we return to the other story, we come to this moment. Verse 27. Jesus and his disciples went on to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. Now, this is about a 25-mile walk, so there's lots of time for talk. There's lots of time for teaching and discussion. And it says then, on the way, verse 27, on the way. That phrase has never been used by Mark up to this point. But between here and chapter 12, Mark's going to use that phrase 9 times. On the way, and others, one of the prophets. And then Jesus says, well, let me give you a fill in the blank now. Who do you say I am? It's to Israel. You're the one, that seems strange. You would think at this point he wants them to go broadcast this news. Why wouldn't he want them to tell everybody? Well, I think that's going to be answered in the next section. Because in verse 31, it says he then, in the rest of the Gospel of Mark, they're going to be trying to convince us of what kind of Messiah he's going to be. You know, the disciples should have known this already. It's been prophesied in the Old Testament, so that's what they played up. That's what Messiah is going to be. And the disciples have grown up in that kind of environment. So they're shocked. I mean, this broadsides them. It blindsides them. They weren't expecting this one. And this is obvious by what Peter does next. Because verse 32 says he spoke plainly about this, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Bless his heart. Give Peter credit, though. I mean, you have to appreciate his boldness, don't you? Even if it's ill-advised, this comment was courageous, and it shows his concern. He wants to rebuke Jesus, but he's polite enough not to rebuke him in front of everybody else. He takes him over to the side so that he can rebuke him, so that he doesn't embarrass him in front of everybody. And we don't know exactly what Peter said, but my guess is it went something like this. And I bet I'm not far off base. My guess is Peter did something like this. Jesus, look me in the eye. Look me right here and repeat after me. I am Messiah. Jesus, you're Messiah. Say this with me, Jesus. I'm not defeated. I will not be killed. I'm going to destroy my enemies. Jesus, enough with this negative stuff. Enough with this defeated talk. You're Messiah. We believe it now. Let's go break some teeth. Now, you never pictured Peter saying all that, did you? But I bet it was closer to that than sometimes the way we do it with flannel graphs and stuff. He's trying to straighten Jesus out here. And in verse 33, it says, but when Jesus turned and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter. Get behind me, Satan, he said. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Wow, that's a harsh statement, isn't it? You might want to write this one down. This is important. Anytime Jesus calls you Satan, it's probably going to be a bad day. Why would Jesus respond so strongly to what Peter said? Well, one reason is something I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Jesus is on the way. Again, something he's going to say Mark's going to say 9 times between here and the end of chapter 12. Jesus is on the way. And every time it says that, it's when Jesus is setting himself resolutely to go to Jerusalem. He's on a mission. Another reason is that Jesus recognized these words or something similar to them because these are the kinds of words that were spoken to him in the wilderness temptations. When Satan said, you know, there is another way. You don't have to do this. No, Messiah has come to die. He's going to die, and he's going to die to accomplish the mission that his Father has given to him. He's going to be obedient to his Father's will. And he knows exactly where he's headed. He's headed to the cross. Now, clearly, when Jesus says that Peter has his mind set on human concerns rather than on God's concerns, it's because Peter has created in his own idea, in his own imagination, he has created who Jesus is supposed to be. The problem is, Peter's idea of Messiah is not the right idea about Messiah. So, back to the story of the blind man. I believe that Mark put this story about the blind man here to use as a parable of sorts, to help us to understand our own blindness. So let me answer some questions by asking a couple of questions. At this moment that we're at right now in the text, did the disciples believe that Jesus is Messiah? Come on. There's just 2 possibilities. Yes. At this moment in the story, did they understand what kind of Messiah Jesus was going to be? No. They can see, but they can't yet see clearly. And as I said earlier, Mark takes 8 chapters answering one question: who is Jesus? And once Peter answers that question in verse 29 and says, you are the Messiah, we're not going to be dealing with that anymore in the Gospel of Mark. From here on, it's going to be Mark trying to convince us the kind of Messiah that Jesus is going to be. And right here, so the disciples, maybe you're thinking right now, an interesting story, Rick, and you're right, it is weird. But what does that have to do with us? And just like Christians in the Western world who think Jesus is supposed to be some kind of a militant leader that's going to come with a bloody sword and correct everything in this world. Others have a Jesus that's a political Jesus. And in these same churches, and yes, there are people here today who miss the inseparable connection between the life Jesus lived and the life that his followers are to live. I'm going to give you a little peek at next week's sermon. And it's going to be tough. But this is what Jesus says. Then he called the crowd to him along with his disciples and said, whoever wants to be my disciple. How many of you here want to be his disciple? Whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. Oh, he was just saying that to the guys in the boat, right? For whoever wants to save their lives will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me and for the gospel will save it. What good is it for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? If anyone is ashamed of me or my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of them when he comes in his Father's glory with the holy angels. So that's your sneak peek at next week. And I want you to hear that Jesus is not talking in this passage just about his life. Jesus is also talking about our lives. He's not the only one who's going to suffer. Anyone who comes after him must deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow him. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means, I'm up here, folks, okay? That means we obey him and do whatever it takes to follow after him. We take up our cross and we follow him. And the only way to save our lives is to lose our lives. So, what Jesus says is that we must not only embrace and trust in the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, but we must also embrace the life and the suffering of Jesus. Now, for many, this is where our vision gets blurry. Because our blindness to the suffering and the rejection of Jesus leads to our blindness to the reality that we must also suffer. And that we must also be rejected if we want to follow him. Are you still willing to sign up? I don't know when we went wrong, and I don't know where we went wrong. And when I say we, I'm talking collectively about Christianity. But somewhere along the line, many people begin to believe that we can enter through the narrow gate without walking the narrow way. That we can somehow accept Jesus' death but not embrace his life. And do you know the saddest part of all? Where did we learn that? We learned it in church. And here's how it went. Depending upon whatever denominational background you're from, it went something like this. Hey, all you have to do is pray a prayer to Jesus. Pray the believer's prayer and you'll be saved. Or, hey, all you have to do is believe and repent and be baptized, and then everything's taken care of. It doesn't really matter how you live after that. And we would probably never say it like that, but sometimes that's the way it's come across to people. That's all you need to do, and then, hey, heaven's yours. Folks, it's not about knowing facts about Jesus. It's about embracing Jesus' death as well as embracing Jesus' life. And what do I mean by embracing Jesus' life? I mean we are to make his life our own. So, how do you answer the question, who is Jesus? It's one of the most intensely debated questions in history. And the answer to this question matters most of all, or it matters not at all, but it cannot matter just a little bit. It's important that we answer this question today. Who is Jesus? And I want to see, don't you? I don't want to see partly. I want to see. So we're going to sing a song of invitation. If you need to respond in any way, we encourage you to do that, to be baptized for prayer. Room 102 with an elder and his wife. But we're going to pray that prayer in song right now, that God will help us to see more clearly. Let's stand together and let's sing.
As we sing, holy, 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 I'm lifted up, shining in the light of your glory. Pour out your power and love as we sing, holy, holy, holy. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see you. I want to see you. Open the eyes of my heart, Lord. Open the eyes of my heart. I want to see